There was a statement by former President Thabo Mbeki over the weekend in which he claimed that he had never interfered with the National Prosecuting Authority and its decisions over whether to prosecute Truth Commission cases. After apartheid, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission held hearings on apartheid-era crimes. It granted amnesty if people had given full disclosure, but it also compiled a list of people who were not granted amnesty or who did not apply for amnesty, who then had to be prosecuted. The NPA never prosecuted those people, and in fact a former head of the NPA, Advocate Pikoli, said on affidavit that the NPA was told not to prosecute those cases when he was head of the NPA. Yasmin Sooka is a human rights lawyer, also a member of the board for the Foundation for Human Rights in South Africa and a former commissioner on the Truth Commission. Ma'am, good afternoon to you and thank you for your time. It was quite a statement from former President Mbeki. How do you assess what he said? Do you believe him that he didn't interfere in the NPA?
No, actually I don't. And, you know, what we must remember is that even the Supreme Court of Appeals confirmed that between 2003 and 2017, the executive adopted a policy position that TRC cases would not be pursued. And, you know, what the ACA also says that this decision was perplexing and inexplicable in terms of the stance it was taken. And one should remember that, Vusi Pikoli, one of the charges when he appeared before the Janwala Commission was this question of the TRC cases and prosecutions. And after he gave testimony, those charges were removed. And I think that really stresses why it is important to have an independent commission of inquiry with obviously the powers of search and seizure and subpoena, because the executive needs to come clean. You know, before Vusi was actually suspended and fired, there was a secret task team, the amnesty task team, that was established, and that was actually to find a new way to give perpetrators of serious violations another bite of the amnesty cherry. And then, of course, President Mbeki himself, you know, tried to create a pardons process, which had serious implications for victims. And it was victims groups who actually went to the courts to stop both processes. So this is not a new matter. And I just wonder why it's taken him more than 10 years to kind of make this kind of statement.
There's sort of elements of I don't know, almost strangeness. Maybe that's too strong a word, but let me say elements that I don't understand with the statement.
Yeah.
He wasn't responding to the Supreme Court of Appeal. He was responding to News 24's reporting, which I think, from what I can see, was accurate, of the Supreme Court of Appeal. And he was responding years after Advocate Pikoli made his statement.
Yeah, so I think that, you know, and clearly, to say that Vusi, you know, should have stood up and did his job is really unfair, because if there was one director of the NPA that was really courageous and brave, it was Vusi Pikoli, because he dared to take on and prosecute TRC matters. And you will recall that, you know, he brought the prosecution against Adrian Flop and Johan van der Merwe. And of course, the operatives who handled the poison, trying to poison Reverend Frank Chikani. And it was really for that case that he was punished. So I would say that, it's really outrageous for President Mbeki to make that kind of statement. Vusi's statement was also supported by the affidavit of the head of the Priority Crimes Litigation Unit, Anton Ackerman, who said that these cases were removed from his care because he was told that he should not prosecute them. And then, of course, you had another affidavit, I think by Chris McAdam and Tari Pretorius, which also alleged political interference. This is an issue that I think needs to be dealt with, and it needs to be probed, because I think we need to look at those officials and ministers who were involved in this process, who kind of suppressed these cases, because when you look at the plight of victims today, so many of them are finding that many of the perpetrators have passed on. And in fact, there are no prosecutions. There also has been very little truth recovery around their cases. And the Craddock 4 case is one of those. The Simelane case is another where you only have 2 perpetrators remaining. One of whom is saying that he's unfit to stand trial because he has dementia. And this case will probably be, delayed for another year while the court comes to this process of dealing with his claims that he's mentally unfit. And so this has been the pattern, really. The NPA seems to wait for perpetrators to pass on before they do something conclusively. And that is why I think it's so outrageous that President Mbeki should call Vusi Pikoli out, because he was the one NPA director that was brave enough to oppose the executive.
What I've never really understood, and you're much closer to it than I, is that Thabo Mbeki at the time was leader of the ANC. It was members of the African National Congress who lost their relatives. The Simelane case is a good example. Lost their relatives to the apartheid government. I mean, people murdered in sometimes the most horrible way. And yet it was the ANC, and from what we can see, an ANC leader, he'll deny it, he has denied it, that was stopping these prosecutions. Now, at the time, after the Truth Commission, which was regarded, I think, by most of the world as a huge success, a sort of model to deal with situations like ours, there would have been widespread political support in the ANC, in South Africa, around the world, to prosecute the people who had denied amnesty. And still it didn't happen. I scratch my head over it still. I'm sure you do too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been so much of a disservice, but also betrayal of why the Truth Commission was set up, given the fact that amnesties in international law are not kosher, but in our case, they were allowed to stand by the international community because what it did provide is that for those who were not granted amnesty or in fact did not apply, the law would follow its course. I think at the foundation, I knocked on a number of doors of politicians at the time to really find out what was at the back of this refusal to deal with the TRC cases. And I think at one point I was told by somebody quite high up in the echelons of the ANC that the other side had threatened that they would bring private prosecutions, and that's why there was the sentiment that they should not proceed. I think the other issue is, of course, this question of informers. And, this is something that we haven't really dealt with conclusively in our country. Every now and again, you get an allegation that somebody was an informer in the pay of the apartheid state. And I think this is an issue that also has to be unraveled because it actually destroys the political discourse in our country. And in my view, that's probably a major reason why the ANC and the ruling party did not want to proceed with prosecutions.
You and others involved in this process have called for an inquiry, and I understand why that would be helpful. Would it not just be met by blank denials from all involved? I mean, would you not just, say such an inquiry called former President Mbeki, for example, would you not just be met with what he said in his statement on Friday?
Well, I think that, what's very clear is that you really do need an independent commission of inquiry, but it has to have, the kind of powers like Judge Zondo had to actually subpoena people before him and also to apply search and seizure. I think when you look at, in fact, Dumisa Nsebeza was appointed by the NPA to conduct some kind of investigation, but it was really toothless because he wasn't given any powers, which would make his inquiry effective. And what he says there, too, is that it's absolutely important that we have this independent commission of inquiry. While you might be met with denial by President Mbeki, there are many other ministers, including the former Justice Minister, Bridget Mabandla, who would have to appear before such a commission. And one would hope that, given that so many years have passed, that they would actually come clean around what happened during that period. You would also hear, I think, conclusively from people like Vusi Pikoli, Anton Ackerman, and the two other NPA prosecutors. And I think that, what that has the potential to do is to uncover what actually happened during that period. So I am quite hopeful, and I think many victims' families are as well, that if we set up this commission of inquiry, and that should be a demand made to whoever, becomes, wins the vote when our elections take place, because I think this is going to be an important step forward. And, commissions of inquiry are interesting things. Yeah, they can be lots of denials before them, but at some point somebody cracks. And what that leads to is an unraveling of the truth, which is necessary for our country to go forward.
Yasmin Sooka, thank you. Human rights lawyer, member of the board for the Foundation for Human Rights in South Africa, and of course a former commissioner to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Ma'am, thank you.